"Come now, Ivolton, confess the thing to us plainly," said Lord Absol, swirling the claret in his glass so that it caught the candle flame like blood held up to the light. "You did not marry her. You were saddled with her. There is a difference, and every man at this table knows it." The laughter came before Rowden answered, the low, well-fed laughter of men who had dined too long and drunk a shade too deep, and who wanted, above all things, to be entertained. It rolled down the length of the great table at Ivolton House, past the ruins of the third course, past the silver and the guttering wax, and Rowden, Duke of Ivolton, felt it settle upon him like an expectation he had spent his whole life learning how to meet. He set down his own glass. He did not drink from it. He had trained himself years ago never to reach for a thing he wanted while other men were watching for the reach. "A difference," he said slowly, "that turns entirely upon whether a man can afford the saddling." He let the corner of his mouth move, not a smile, only the memory of one. "I can afford a great many things, Absol." They laughed again harder, and he despised how easily it was done. 7 of them sat about him, the great and the idle of 3 counties, men who had ridden to his door because a summons from the Duke of Ivolton was not a thing one declined, and who now warmed themselves at his fire and drank his cellar dry and looked to him to be the cruel and clever creature they had always found him. He was very good at it. That was the trouble. He had been very good at it for so long that he scarcely remembered choosing it, only that once. A lifetime ago, a boy of 11 had stood in a cold gallery and wept before a father who told him that a duke does not weep, a duke does not want, a duke shows the world nothing it might one day use to bleed him, and the boy had believed it, and the man had become it, and the belief had hardened around his heart like a round fruit no one would ever taste. "But the whole county says she came with nothing," pressed Mr. Hollith, a florid man who had married money himself and never forgiven anyone for having more of it. "A parson's ward, was it not? Or some such. No name, no portion, no connection that signifies. One hears the marriage was near a charity." "One hears a great many things," Rowden said. "Then correct us," said Absol, delighted, sensing sport. "Tell us she is a treasure. Tell us the Duke of Ivolton searched all England and found his heart's own jewel in a country parsonage." He spread his hands. "We are all attention." And there it was, the small open door of it, the invitation to be witty at another's expense, and Rowden knew even as he stepped through it, that he was stepping through it, and could not for the life of him have said why he did not turn back. Perhaps because the alternative was to defend her, and to defend her was to admit she was worth defending, and to admit that was to hand these grinning men a thing they might one day use to bleed him. His father's voice, cold as the gallery, moved in him like a current under ice. "My wife," he said, "is a quiet woman. I will grant her that virtue, since it is the only one that has not cost me." He turned the stem of his glass a half-circle upon the cloth. "She keeps my accounts of linen and does not speak above her breath and asks for nothing, which is as well, for she brought nothing to ask it with. A man does not marry such a woman, gentlemen. He assumes her, as one assumes a mortgage upon an estate he did not choose to encumber. She is a duty I discharge. She is, if you will have the plain word for it, a burden borne handsomely, and I flatter myself I bear my burdens better than most." The table roared. Absol struck the board with the flat of his hand. Hollith wheezed into his napkin. A lean young viscount at the far end laughed the loudest of all, being newest and most anxious to belong. Rowden received it the way he received everything, with a still face and a level eye, and told himself it was cleverly done, and felt, beneath the rind, in the place he did not look, the first faint stir of something that was not triumph at all. He would examine it later, he decided. He would examine it never, for it was in that precise moment, with the laughter still cresting, that he saw her. She was standing in the doorway that gave onto the passage from the still room, and she had a branch of candles in one hand, for she had come, as she came each night, to see that the great fires were banked safely before the house slept, a task the housekeeper had long since surrendered to her, since the young Duchess did it more gently and forgot nothing. Letty, his wife of 14 months, whom he could not, in that instant, remember having looked at properly in a fortnight. She was not richly dressed. She never was. She took nothing from him that she had not first been made to feel she had earned, and she had never once let him see her feel it. The candle light was on her face, and her face told him, with a completeness that no cry or reproach could have matched, that she had heard him, every word, from the first. She'd not dropped the candles. That was the thing he would remember afterward, in the long, unspooling nights to come, that a woman so used, so lately and so publicly named a burden before 7 strangers, did not so much as let the flame tremble. She looked at him. Not with hatred. He could have borne hatred. He was armored head to foot against hatred. She looked at him the way one looks at a thing one has finally, after long hoping otherwise, understood. Then she inclined her head to him, to the guests, a small grave courtesy that shamed the whole braying table more than any speech, and she turned, and the light went out of the doorway with her, and the passage swallowed her up. No one else had marked it. The men were still laughing. Absol was already embarking upon some further impertinence. The moment had cost Rowden nothing that any of them could see. He lifted his glass at last and drank, and the claret was sour in his mouth, and he could not have told them why. "You are a hard man, Ivolton," said Absol admiringly, wiping his eyes. "God, but you are a hard man. I should not like to be the creature bound to you." "No," said Rowden, looking at the empty doorway. "I don't suppose you would. He'd not go after her." Of course he did not go after her. The thought did not so much as form itself as a possibility, for the Duke of Ivolton did not rise from his own table to chase a woman down a servant's passage on account of a look. He remained. He commanded the port to be brought, and the walnuts, and he was, by every report that would circulate the county for a week, in tremendous form that night, sharp, glittering, magnificently cold, the very Duke his father had built. But some quiet mechanism in him had come loose from its housing, and all through the long remainder of that dinner, whenever the laughter fell for an instant, he heard again the particular silence of a woman who had chosen not to let a flame shake. She had come to him, that woman, out of a parsonage in a green flat country he had never troubled to visit, given over to his keeping by an uncle glad to be quit of the charge, a niece too well born to send to service and too poor to marry anywhere near her blood. The match had suited Rowden precisely because nothing about it engaged him. He had needed a wife, the succession required it, his steward reminded him of it, and he had wanted, above all, a wife who would ask nothing of the guarded and shuttered rooms of him, who would take his name and his rank and his houses and leave the man himself sealed and unvisited. Letty Norcott had seemed made for the purpose. She had come to him with her few plain gowns and her mother's Bible and a way of being in a room without disturbing it, and he had congratulated himself on the wisdom of the arrangement, and he had, with a thoroughness he only now began dimly to perceive, never once asked her a single question to which he did not already believe he knew the answer. He knew, for instance, that she was quiet. He had said so at his own table, and been applauded for it. He did not know that she read Greek, though Mother's Bible was Greek on one page and English on the facing one, and she had taught herself both by turns in a cold parsonage attic. He knew that she kept his accounts of linen. He did not know that she had also, without a word to anyone, corrected an error in the steward's coal reckoning that had been quietly beggaring the North tenants for 2 winters, and had done it in such a way that the steward believed the correction his own. He knew that she asked for nothing. He had never once asked himself what it cost a living soul to have learned, so young, to ask for nothing, nor what such a soul might be worth entire, to any man with the wit to want it. There had been a morning he remembered now, some 3 months into the marriage. The memory rose unbidden and unwelcome, the way a thing long pushed under will rise, when he had come upon her in the long gallery, at the far cold end where the old duchesses hung in their dark varnish, and she had been standing before the portrait of his mother. He had not known she knew which one it was, he had never told her. Yet she had stood there quite still, her plain morning gown grey against the gilded frame, and when he had asked her, more sharply than the moment warranted, what she did there, she had turned and said only, "She has your eyes about the temple, and yours are the loneliest eyes in England. I wondered where you came by them." Then she had gone on down the gallery to her tasks, leaving him rooted upon the cold parquet, robbed of every word he owned. He had thought her impertinent. He had told himself so all that day. He had not, he understood now with a slow and creeping horror, told himself the truth, which was that no living soul had looked into him and named what was there in 14 years, and that he had spent the whole of the day since trying not to be glad of it. The port went round, the fire sank. Somewhere above and behind the wainscot, in the sleeping bones of the great house, a young woman was going quietly from hearth to hearth with a branch of candles, seeing that no flame was left to catch the night, and thinking her own thoughts, which the Duke of Ivolton had never in 14 months troubled to learn. "You've gone grave on us, Ivolton," Absol observed, peering at him over the rim of his glass with the shrewdness that drink had not yet drowned. "A man says a clever thing and then broods upon it as though he'd said a foolish one. Surely you do not repent of the poor mouse?" "I repent of nothing," Rowden said, and heard, distantly, how untrue it was even as the words left him, for the word repent had never before this hour meant anything to him at all, had been a thing preachers said, and now it sat upon his tongue with a weight, and he found he could not set it down. A man does not repent of the plain truth. No, Absol agreed comfortably, and turned to torment Holithy instead, and let him be. But the question had lodged. Was it the plain truth? He had believed it entire an hour since. He had built 14 months upon believing it. And a single grave courtesy in a doorway had shown him the belief for what it was, not truth at all, but the most comfortable of all the lies he had told himself, the one that let him keep his wife at the length of his own outstretched arm, and never once feel the cost of the keeping. It was near 2 when the last of them stumbled up to bed, Absol leaning heavy on a footman, Holither promising over his shoulder to bring his guns for the coverts in the morning, the young Viscount too far gone in drink to do more than bow at the newel post as though it were his host. Rowden saw them off with his back to the dying fire and his face composed and the same cold courtesy for each that he showed to all the world. When the hall was empty he did not go up. He stood a while in the wreck of his own hospitality, among the smeared glasses and the spent candles and the smell of wine gone flat, and he was, for the first time in longer than he could reckon, entirely alone with no one to be a duke in front of. He crossed to the doorway where she had stood. There was nothing there. A cooling stub of tallow on the flags, one bead of wax fallen and gone hard where she had held the branch, that was all. He looked at it for a foolish length of time. Then he told himself, in his father's very voice, that he was overtired and had drunk more than was his custom, and that a man did not stand in a doorway at 2 in the morning turning over a serving look from his own wife as though it were a summons. He went up the corridor to his apartments past the door of hers, for the arrangement of the house had given them adjoining rooms whether the marriage had wanted them or no, and he saw as he came level with it that a line of light still showed beneath the door. She was awake, then. He stopped. He raised his hand. He was never afterward able to account for the hand. It went of its own accord, the knuckles a breath from the panel, the whole strange unpracticed impulse to knock, to speak, to say some word he did not possess into the space between them. And then he heard her very low on the other side of the door, not weeping, he had braced himself, without knowing it, for weeping, but singing. A few bars only, half under her breath, some plain air her mother must have taught her in that green flat country, the kind of tune a woman sings to steady herself and not to be heard. There was no grief in it that he could name. There was something far worse. There was peace. She was making her peace with something alone behind a shut door, in the house that bore her name, and she had not come to him to make it, because he had shown her, over 14 unbroken months and one final polished sentence before his friends, that he was the last soul in England to whom such a thing could be brought. Rowden lowered his hand. He stood in the cold corridor and listened to his wife sing to herself through an inch of oak, and the rind about his heart gave, not broke. It did not break that night. It would take a great deal more to break it, but gave, some hairline fracture running through it that let in a single cold thread of the truth, which was that he had said a thing at his table that was not clever at all, and that a woman he did not know had heard it, and that he minded. He minded more than he had minded anything in 20 years, who prided himself before all the world that nothing could reach him, had been reached, and by the one person he had married expressly so as never to be. He did not knock. That was the measure of the man he still was that night, that he stood at the very door with the fracture running live through him, and turned at the last and went on to his own cold room and did not knock. A duke does not want. A duke shows the world nothing it might use to bleed him. He lay a long while in the dark with his eyes open, and the singing had stopped by the time he reached his bed, and the silence that followed it was the loudest thing he had ever heard. In the morning he would find her at the breakfast table, composed and courteous and asking nothing, pouring his coffee the way she always poured it, with no word of the night before upon her lips, and he would tell himself he had imagined the whole of it. He would be wrong. Some things, once heard through an inch of oak, cannot be unheard. Some doors, once a man has stood at them and not knocked, do not open so easily again. But that reckoning lay ahead of him, weeks of it, a slow and terrible schooling, and on this first night he knew only that he could not sleep, and did not know why, and would have laughed in the face of any man who told him that a burden borne handsomely had just become the single weight that would break him. Below, in the emptied hall, the last candle he had left burning guttered once in a draught from the passage down which she had gone and went on its own, unhelped, for the first time in 14 months that no quiet hand had come to see it safe. He was wrong, of course, about the imagining. He came down late to the small breakfast room with his head aching and his resolve set that he had dreamed the greater part of the night, and there she was, exactly as he had foretold, composed, courteous, seated at the foot of the table in a grey morning gown with her hair drawn plainly back, pouring his coffee before he had so much as asked for it, and it undid his resolve entirely, for she did not look at him the way a woman looks who has forgotten a wound. She looked at him the way a woman looks who has folded a wound away very neatly and put it where it will not be found, which is a different thing, and a man who has spent his life reading faces across a card table knows the difference in his bones. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, and set the cup at his place, and there was nothing in her voice at all. That was the whole of it. There was nothing in her voice, and Rawdon discovered that he had grown so accustomed to the small nothing of her that he had never once heard it as an achievement until the night before had taught him what it cost to make. Norcott, he said. He had called her Norcott from the first, as though she were still a name on a settlement and not a wife, and then found absurdly that he had nothing to follow it. The men would be down within the hour, roaring for their guns and their kidneys. Holith had promised the coverts. The day was already spoken for from end to end. There was no earthly reason for the Duke of Ivelton to sit across a breakfast table struggling after a sentence. He took up the coffee. "You were about the house late," he said. It came out an accusation, which he had not intended, and he saw the small stillness go through her. There was the plate to see to after, she said, and the fires. Absol's man had let the one in the blue room go quite out, and his master would have frozen by morning. "You saw to Absol's fire. Someone must, Your Grace. He is your guest." She said it without a grain of reproach, which was somehow worse than any reproach could have been, and she rose and gathered the pot to carry it herself to the hearth to keep warm rather than ring for a girl to do it, and the plain grey back of her was the most eloquent thing in the room. He had called her a burden at his own table, before 6 laughing men, and she had gone from the room and mended their fires so that his hospitality should not shame him in the cold hour before dawn. It was not the act of a burden. It was the act of a woman carrying the whole weight of a house that did not know it was being carried. He said nothing more. He could not find the shape of what he wanted to say, and a lifetime of never wanting had left him without the tools for it. And so he did what the Duke of Ivelton always did when the ground grew uncertain beneath him. He rose and bowed the exact degree that courtesy required, and went out to his guests, and was magnificent, and left her by the fire with the coffee pot in her 2 hands. The shooting party was 4 days agoing, and might have been 40 for all the good it did him. He walked out over his own stubble behind his own dogs with Absol braying at his elbow, and he brought down his birds cleanly because his hand had never in his life betrayed him, and all the while some new and unwelcome faculty in him had woken and would not sleep again. He kept catching sight of her. That was the plain fact of it, laid out flat. For 14 months the house had been full of her going quietly about it, and he had never once caught sight of her, and now he could not cross a room without his eye finding the grey gown at the edge of it. In the still room with her sleeves turned back, weighing dry things on a little brass balance. In the long gallery with a housemaid, showing the girl how a thing was to be done rather than merely commanding it done. At the foot of the stairs with the second gardener, of all people, bent over some paper spread on the newel, the 2 of them frowning at it like scholars. He asked on the 3rd day what the paper had been. He asked it of the gardener, not of her, 'cause he could not yet bring himself to ask it of her. And the man went red and stammered that her grace had found the fault in the melon frames, the reason the fruit had failed 2 seasons running, that it was the flue laid wrong beneath and none of them had seen it, and her grace had drawn it out for him plain on paper so he might set it right. And there was more the man let slip, warming despite himself to the subject. It was her grace who came down of a morning to the kitchen court while the house still slept, her grace who had settled the long quarrel between the cook and the dairy over the reckoning of the butter. Her grace who had sat 2 hours in the cold with the underkeeper's wife when the child came badly and the doctor was 3 parishes off in the snow. There's not a soul below stairs would hear a word against her, your grace, the gardener said, and then stopped, appalled at his own boldness, twisting his cap. Not that any would, I only mean she is thought a great deal of below. A very great deal. She has a great head for a thing, your grace, the gardener said, and then looked frightened, as though he had said too much and might be turned off for praising the Duchess above the Duke's notice. Begging your pardon. No, said Rowden slowly, looking down the gallery to where the grey gown had just gone from sight. No, you are quite right. She has a great head for a thing, and he stood turning it over, this small astonishment, that the woman he had married expressly to be nothing had been quietly refounding the ruined economy of 3 of his estates, while he shot his birds and drank his port, and thought her a piece of furniture that poured coffee, and that she had done it, every stroke of it, without once coming to him to be thanked or noticed or paid the smallest coin of regard. She had asked for nothing. She had asked for nothing so completely that he had believed there was nothing there to ask. It was into the 4th evening that Odalis Marchetti arrived. She came in a travelling carriage with a crest not quite her own and a maid and a great many boxes, the widow of a Genoese banker and the ornament of every drawing-room between 3 counties, and she came, she declared, sweeping into the great hall in a cloud of sable and scent, only because dear Ivolton's park was on her road to the Holathers and she could not, simply could not, pass so near the most feared man in England without begging a night's shelter and the pleasure of being terrified by him at his own table. The men adored her within the quarter hour. She was clever in the way that costs nothing and pleases everyone, a wit that flattered where it seemed to wound, a laugh laid ready for every jest before the jest was fairly out, and she turned the whole of it upon Rowden like a lamp turned full on a wall, and watched to see what warmth it woke. He knew the manoeuvre. He had seen it performed at him since he was 22 and come into the title. The Marchioness of the world scented the great cold houses of unloved men the way a hound scents a covert, and he had learned long ago to stand in the middle of all that heat entirely unmoved, which only made them try the harder. Ordinarily it wearied him. Tonight, seated once more at the head of his own table with the candles lit and the same 6 men reassembled and Odalis Marchetti glittering at his right hand, he found that it did more than weary him. It set his teeth on edge, and he could not, for some moments, have said why, until Odalis turned her lamp a fraction lower down the table and let it fall upon Letty. And this, she said, is the Duchess. But how quiet you are, my dear. I declare I had quite taken you for one of the family. You sit so still one might paint the room and never think to put you in. She said it sweetly, sweetly, over the rim of her glass, and the laugh was laid ready round the table as it had been 4 nights before, and Absol, who never learned, drew the breath to take it up. And Rowden, who 4 nights before had provided the very sentence the laugh was waiting for, sat in his chair and felt the whole warm cruelty of it swing round the table toward the grey gown at the foot, and something in him that he had not known was there rose up cold and fast to meet it. But before he could speak, before he'd even resolved what unheard of thing he meant to do, whether to freeze the widow with a look or turn the jest or commit some other folly wholly unlike himself, Letty spoke, not sharply, not with any heat at all. She set down her spoon and lifted her clear grey eyes to the dazzling woman on the Duke's right, and said in that same voice with nothing in it, "You are kind to notice me, madam. I have found it is a great advantage, being easily overlooked. One hears a very great deal that was not meant to be heard, and learns which of a man's guests are his friends and which are merely on the road to somewhere better." There was a silence of a particular quality. Odalis Marchetti's smile did not falter. She was far too accomplished for that. But it set, the way a thing sets that has been caught out in the cold, and the young Viscount gave a short bark of astonished laughter and turned it hastily into a cough, and Rowden at the head of his own table felt something happen in his chest that he had no name for and had not felt in 20 years. It was not quite delight. It was too near to pain for delight. It was the sensation of watching a person one has utterly failed to see step, all at once and without raising her voice, into the full light of what she is, and of knowing oneself in the same instant to have been the blindest man in the room. Nor was Rowden the only one to feel the turn of it. Down the table he saw old Holliver set down his glass and look at the grey gown at the foot with a new and full attention, as a man looks who has walked past a plain door 100 times and heard, at last, that there is treasure behind it, and even Absol's mouth, opened for the ready laugh, closed again upon nothing, and he reached instead for his wine and drank it in some confusion, as though he had been caught in the act of a thing he had not, until that moment, known to be shabby. "How droll she is," said Odalys at last, recovering, laying the laugh down over the crack as neatly as a cloth over a stain. "Yvelton, you never told us your Duchess had teeth." "No," said Rowden. He was looking at Letty, and he did not trouble to look away, and he heard his own voice come out low and even and strange to him. "I did not know it myself." Letty's eyes came up to his then, the first time in 4 days, in 14 months, that she had truly looked at him and let him see her looking, and held there a moment across the whole length of the table, over the candles and the plate and the 6 turned faces, and he could not read what was in it, and that was the thing that finished him. 14 months he had sat across from a woman whose face he had believed he could read at a glance, whose whole being he had summed and settled and filed away as quiet as nothing, as a burden borne handsomely. And now she looked at him down the length of his own table, and he could not read her at all, and he understood, with a lurch like a mist stare in the dark, that he had never been able to, that there had been a whole living country behind those grey eyes the entire time, green and flat and unvisited, and he had ridden past the borders of it every day for a year, and never once thought to ask what lay within. She looked away first. She took up her spoon again and returned to her soup as though nothing whatever had passed, and left him staring. And the talk closed over the moment and rolled on, Holly upon his coverts, Absol upon a mare he meant to buy, Odalys turning her lamp back full upon the Duke and finding, to her plain vexation, that some part of him had gone out of the room and would not be summoned back to be warmed at her fire. He was very quiet the rest of that dinner. His guests, who knew his silences of old and reckoned them so many degrees of scorn, took it for the great Duke wearied of them and were flattered rather than offended, as men are who wish to be feared by a man they envy. Not one of them marked that the Duke of Yvelton kept looking all through the 2nd course and the 3rd, down the long shining table to the foot, where a young woman in grey ate her supper, and asked for nothing and gave no sign at all that she knew herself watched, and was watched, for the first time in her married life, by the one man who had sworn he never would be moved. When the cloth was drawn and the women withdrew, Odalys rose in a rustle of sable, and swept past the foot of the table, and Rowden saw her pause there, saw her bend and murmur something low at Letty's ear as she passed. Some barbed sweet nothing meant to leave its little wound where the men could not see. He could not hear the words, but he saw Letty's face as she received them, saw the small serene incline of her head, the untroubled courtesy with which she rose and gave the widow precedence to the door as her rank required, giving way, as she gave way in all things, and losing nothing of herself in the giving, and he thought, watching it, she has done this 1,000 times. She has stood at the foot of 1,000 tables and taken the barbed sweet nothings of 1,000 Odalys marchetis and inclined her head and given way and gone out last through the door, and she has never once told a living soul, least of all me, and I called that a burden. The men roared for their port. Rowden gave the order without hearing himself give it. It began upon some story. The young Viscount refilled his glass 3 times over. The candles burned down another inch, and the Duke of Yvelton sat at the head of it all with the decanter going round, and his face composed in the cold courteous mask his father had built for him, and thought of nothing, could think of nothing, but a pair of clear grey eyes that had looked at him down the length of a table and let him see, for one unguarded moment, that there was a whole soul behind them he had never taken the trouble to meet, He rose earlier than his custom. He left them to it, left Absol in the middle of his story, which no man had done at that table in living memory, and which set the six of them murmuring behind him that Ivelton grew strange, that Marchetti woman must have vexed him, that a man ought not to shoot 4 days on his own port and wonder that his temper turned. He heard none of it. He went out into the cold hall, and stood a moment at the foot of the great stair, and looked up it toward the corridor where a line of light would presently show beneath a certain door, and knew, with the first clear knowledge he had had of anything in a very long while, that he could not go on as he had gone, that the thing was done, that some door in himself had come open on its own, the way the last candle had gone out on its own 4 nights before, unhelped, and that no amount of standing at it and not knocking was going to shut it again. He did not go up at once. He was not ready. He did not yet know what a man did with such a knowledge, having spent his whole life making sure he should never come by it. But he stood at the foot of his own stair a long time, with the laughter of his friends dying away behind the closed door of the dining room, and for once he did not curate his face for anyone, because there was no one there to see it, and what was on it, had any soul been by to read it, was the look of a man who has ridden past the same green country every day for a year, and has just, tonight, at his own table, over the candles and the plate, been shown the gate standing open, and has understood, too late and all at once, that he would give the whole of his cold magnificent estate to be let inside. The shooting party did not disperse, as Rowden had privately hoped it might. It swelled. Word had gone about the county that Ivelton kept open house, and by the Thursday the coverts were being walked by a dozen guns and the drawing-rooms filled with their wives, so that a dinner which he had meant to be small had grown into a thing of 24 covers, blazing with the second-best plate and loud the particular gaiety of people determined to be seen enjoying a duke's hospitality. He stood it as he stood all such evenings, at the head of his own table, magnificent and remote, and told himself he was glad of the noise, for noise was a thing a man could hide inside of. He was not glad of it. He had discovered, in the 4 days since a branch of candles had gone out of a doorway, that noise no longer served him as it once had. It used to close over him like water. Now it seemed to part around a single quiet point in the room, and the quiet point was his wife. She sat where the table's arrangement had put her, well down from him, between old Sir Cardell Musgrave, who was deaf in the near ear and had turned the other toward the lady on his farther side, and an empty chair whose occupant had risen to lean across 3 places and shout wit at somebody nearer the salt. Letty sat within the racket and was not of it. No one addressed her. She had been, Rowden observed with a slowly gathering discomfort he could not name and did not welcome, effectively removed from the dinner while remaining seated at the centre of it, passed over in the general commerce of flattery and gossip as a stone is passed over by a stream, the water finding it easier to go around. And she bore it as she bore everything, with her hands quiet in her lap between the courses, and her grey eyes attentive, and her back very straight, taking no more notice of the slight than she took of the weather, as one does not take notice of a thing one has long since ceased to expect otherwise. It was Mrs. Orderly's Marchetti who made the slight audible. She had come down from town with the Absols, a widow of large fortune and larger reputation for cleverness, dressed always a half-season ahead of the county and armed with a laugh that could be heard across 2 rooms. Rowden had known her a little years ago, in the way that a man of his rank knew every handsome woman who wished to be known by him. She had at one time entertained expectations of him herself, and had never quite forgiven their disappointment, had transmuted the grievance, as such women will, into a bright and public fondness that was worse than any coldness. She sat near his end of the table and had spent the fish and the fowl exerting herself to be delightful for him, and finding him harder work than she remembered, she cast about, as a bored and clever woman casts about, for some fresh amusement to lay before him. "But we are neglecting the Duchess," she said suddenly, into a lull, in a voice pitched to Carey. She turned her dark head down the table with an air of gracious rescue. "Your Grace, you sit so very silent. You must forgive us our town chatter. We forget ourselves. Tell us, do you find you have grown used to it all yet? The plate, the people, the being a duchess? I confess I should find it a prodigious deal to grow used to coming from." A small musical hesitation, exquisitely timed, From wherever it was you came. A parsonage, was it? How restful that must have been, how very quiet. The insult was beautifully made. It named her low, it named her out of place, it named the whole table's private knowledge of her, and it did it all in the accents of kindness, so that to take offence would be to prove oneself unable to bear a friendly word, and to take none would be to swallow the thing whole. Rowden felt the table hold its breath and enjoy itself. He felt, too, a thing he had not felt in the whole of his adult life across his own board, a sharp and sudden wish to strike a guest. It astonished him. He set it down hard, the way he set down every dangerous impulse, and he watched his wife and waited. With a tightness in his chest he did not examine, to see her wounded. She was not wounded, or if she was, she did not hand the wound to the room to be admired. "I came from Norcott, in the flat country beyond Halloway," Letty said. Her voice was low and even and reached every corner, for she had not raised it, and yet the noise had dropped enough to let it through. It was quiet, ma'am, yes. My uncle's living was small and the house was cold, and we had no plate at all worth the naming. We ate off the same 6 pewter plates my grandmother was married with. She said it without a flicker of shame, as another woman might have named a great estate. And something in the plainness of it stopped the ready laugh in several throats. So I have grown used to a good deal that is new since, but I find that the getting used to a thing is not so hard as people fear. One learns what is worth troubling over and what is not. She let her eyes rest a moment upon Mrs. Marchetti, mild and clear and entirely without malice. "The pewter I do not miss, but I would not have you think it taught me nothing. A cold house teaches one to value warmth wherever it is truly offered, and to know it, ma'am, from the counterfeit." For a moment no one spoke. Then Sardell, who had heard perhaps a third of it and mislaid the rest, boomed that the pewter was the very thing. He'd sworn by pewter all his life, and the table laughed in relief and rushed gladly back into its own noise, and the danger passed. Mrs. Marchetti smiled her bright smile and turned it upon Rowden and remarked that his Duchess was a droll little creature, was she not? And Rowden, looking down the length of his own table at the woman he had married so as never to have to look at her, said nothing at all. Because he did not trust the thing that would come out of him if he opened his mouth. He had seen it. He had seen the whole of it, the trap laid in honey, and the quiet foot that stepped over it without hurry, and the small returned blow so gently given that its victim could not even cry out without confessing the wound. And he had seen the cost of it too, which only a man watching very closely could have seen. The single slow breath she took afterward, the way her hand had closed once upon the stuff of her gown beneath the table's edge and then, deliberately, opened it again. She had not been untouched. She had chosen to appear so. It was, he thought, precisely the thing he himself did, and had done for 20 years, and had believed until this week that he alone in all the world had the strength and the loneliness to do. And here was this parson's ward. This pewter-plate girl he had named a burden to amuse better men than himself, doing it more finely than he had ever done it, and doing it with something he had lost so long ago he had forgotten its name. She did it without cruelty. When he armoured himself, he did it by wounding first. She had let Mrs. Marchetti keep her dignity even while declining to surrender her own. He had not known the thing could be done that way. He had not known there was a way to be strong that did not first require someone else to bleed. The dinner wore itself out. The ladies withdrew. The men sat over their wine. Hollister told a long story about a dog. Rowden heard none of it. When at last the party broke and drifted toward the card tables and the pianoforte, he found that he had risen and quitted the drawing-room almost before he had decided to. Driven out by the heat and the candle smoke and the unbearable brightness of Mrs. Marchetti's laugh, and had gone looking. He would not, even to himself, use the word looking, had gone to walk off his restlessness in the cool of the long gallery, where the old duchesses hung in their dark varnish and no one ever went at night. She was there. She stood at the far cold end, a single candle set upon the sill beside her, exactly where he had found her once before the portrait of his mother, not looking at it now, but standing near it. Her hands folded, her face turned to the black window, and the park beyond it where nothing could be seen but her own faint reflection and the candles. She had escaped the drawing-room as he had. Of course she had. He stopped in the shadow of the doorway and knew he should withdraw. That a gentleman withdrew, that to come upon his wife alone in the dark was to owe her either speech or a decent retreat, and he found he could do neither, and stood rooted, as he had stood rooted before her once already in this same gallery, robbed of every word he owned. She saw his reflection in the glass before he moved. "Your Grace." She did not start. She turned and inclined her head, and made as if to gather her candle and go, offering him the room the way she offered him everything, first and without being asked, and expecting nothing in return. "Stay." It came out of him rougher than he meant, and he saw her pause. He had not planned to speak. The word had simply arrived, the way the raised hand had arrived at her door 4 nights since. He crossed toward her slowly, over the cold parquet, past the rank dead ladies in their frames, and stopped a careful distance off, and could not think, now that he had bid her stay, what under heaven he had meant to say. "You need notin' from me," he said at last. "It is your gallery as much as mine. More, perhaps. You are the only soul in this house who ever comes to it. I like the quiet of it," she said simply, "and the company." She glanced up at the portrait beside her, at the long grave face and the lonely eyes. "She does not require to be entertained." It was very near to wit, and there was no barb in it, and it undid him a little. He looked at his mother's face, which he had spent 30 years not looking at, and then at his wife's, which he had spent 14 months not seeing, and the resemblance he found was not in the features at all. "That was ably done at dinner," he said abruptly. "Mrs. Marchetti is reckoned the cleverest woman in 3 counties. She does not often come off the worse." "I did not wish her to come off the worse," Letty said. "I only wished not to be made small in a room I must live the rest of my life in. There is a difference, though I grant it is a fine one." She studied him a moment, and he had the sensation, unfamiliar and not wholly unwelcome, of being looked at by someone who was not calculating what he could do for them. "You were angry," she said, "at my end of the table. I saw it." "You need not have been. I am quite equal to Mrs. Marchetti. I saw that you were." He hesitated upon the very edge of the shuttered rooms of himself, and then, because the gallery was dark and the house was loud and far away and no man was watching him for the reach, he stepped a little way through the door he had kept shut against all comers for 20 years. "I have wondered," he said low, "how you come to bear it. Any of it, the being overlooked. I have watched you these 4 days bear what would sour most women into bitterness or break them into tears, and you do neither. You simply stand. I should like to know how it is done." She was quiet for a moment. When she answered, she did not look at him, but at the dark window, at the 2 small reflected flames. "You bear it the same way, Your Grace," she said. "I have watched too. You stand at the head of a table full of men who would use you, and you show them nothing, and you call it strength. And it is a kind of strength. I do not deny it you." She turned then, and her grey eyes came to his, and they were non-kind, and that was the terrible thing, that they were not unkind. "But I think you are the loneliest man I have ever known, and I have known some lonely ones. You have built yourself a house within your house, and you sit in it alone, and you have persuaded yourself that the sitting alone is the same as being safe. It is not the same. I learned the difference in a cold parsonage. I had hoped, when I came here, that I might not have to go on learning it." She said it without reproach, as one states a fact of weather, and it went into him deeper than any reproach could have gone. "You asked how I bear being overlooked. I will tell you the whole of it. Bear it because I know what I am worth, and I do not require the room to tell me. I only wish," and here, for the first and only time, her steady voice touched something and drew back from it, "I only wish I had married a man who required the room to tell him nothing either. I thought, when they described you to me, that I had. I was told you were proud. I did not understand that proud and lonely are so often the same word. No one had spoken to him so in his life. Not his father, who had commanded, not his friends, who flattered. Not one living soul had stood within the length of his arm and named the thing at the center of him without flinching and without wanting anything from the naming. He felt the rind about his heart give again. That hairline fracture from the night of the dinner running suddenly longer, and the cold thread of truth widening to a stream, and for one perilous instant he stood on the very brink of saying to her the thing he had never said to anyone, that she was right. That the house within the house was cold, that he had known it since he was 11 years old and weeping in this same gallery, that he did not want to sit in it alone any longer and did not know how to come out. He said none of it. The habit of 20 years closed over him like a hand. He felt the mask settle back upon his own face from the inside, felt his spine draw up and his voice cool, and hated it even as it happened, and could not stop it happening. "You presume a good deal, madam," he said, and heard how his father would have said it, upon a look across a dinner table. Something went out of her face, not surprise, she had expected it. That was the worst of all, that she had expected it. She inclined her head, the small grave courtesy that shamed him more than any anger could have done. "I do, your grace," she said quietly. "Forgive me, I forget my place." "I will not do so again," and she took up her candle from the sill, and made him her curtsy, and went away down the long gallery, past the dead duchesses, and the light went with her, and left him standing in the dark before his mother's portrait with the whole of the unsaid thing burning in his throat. He stood there a great while. He told himself he had done rightly. A duke did not stand in a dark gallery unburdening his soul to a wife he scarcely knew. He had reasserted the proper distance, and she had accepted it, and the thing was well. He told himself this in his father's voice, and his father's voice, for the first time in his life, did not entirely convince him, for he had felt, in the moment before he armored himself, what it might be to be looked at and understood and not to lose by it, and he had turned from it deliberately back into the cold, and he understood, standing alone in the ruin of the only honest conversation he had held in 20 years, that he had done it not because he was strong but because he was afraid. The plainness of it appalled him. He went up at last through the emptying house. He did not pass her door. He took the other stair on purpose and despised himself for the purpose. And he lay again a long while in the dark with his eyes open, and this time there was no singing through the oak to trouble him, only the far small sounds of the last guests going to their beds, and his own thoughts, which he could no longer command as once he had. "I know what I am worth," she had said, "and I do not require the room to tell me." He turned the words over and over in the dark. He had said 4 nights since that she was a burden borne handsomely. He knew now that he had been wrong in every particular but one. There was a weight in the house, right enough. He had felt it settle on him at the dinner, and again in the gallery, and it lay upon him now in the dark and would not lift, but it was not the weight of a burden. It was the weight of a thing he had been given, and had not valued, and was beginning 4 nights too late and behind the shut door of his own cold pride, most terribly to want. He did not go up that night after all. He stood at the foot of the stair until the candle in his hand had guttered down to a blue bead, and the last of the laughter behind the dining-room door had thinned to the scrape of chairs and the heavy tread of men going unsteadily to their beds. And then he turned aside into his own book-room and sat before a dead grate until the small hours, doing nothing that a man could have named, and rose the next morning no wiser and a good deal colder, and told himself it had been the port and the widow's scent and the strangeness of 4 days penned indoors with fools. He very nearly believed it. He was a man of great gifts in the matter of believing what suited him. It was, he would come to see, the chief of his accomplishments, and the one he had practiced longest. But the party broke up that day and the day following. The sportsmen carried off by their own affairs as suddenly as they had come, and Absol wringing his hand at the door and swearing it had been the finest 4 days' shooting in the 3 kingdoms, and old Holliver pausing on the step to say, with a dry sidelong look Rowden did not care for, that he congratulated Ivelton on his duchess, that a man who had got himself so quiet and so capable a wife had done better for his house than he perhaps yet knew, and going off to his carriage before the Duke could frame either agreement or rebuff. Odalys Marchetti was the last to go. She stayed a second not unasked, and a third, and made her farewells at last only when it grew plain, even to her, that the lamp she kept turning full upon the Duke had ceased entirely to find a wall to warm, and now shone out into empty air. She went with every grace and no ill humour that a stranger could have marked, but she paused as she was handed up into the carriage, and looked back at the great grey front of the house with its rows of blind windows, and then at Rowden where he stood bareheaded on the steps performing the last office of a host, and she said sweetly, sweetly, "You are changed, Ivelton, since I came. I hope, for your sake, it agrees with you." Changing does not agree with everyone. and she was gone down the avenue in a spatter of gravel before he had decided whether it had been a kindness or a threat. The house, emptied, was very still. He had thought he wanted it so. For 4 days he had wished the whole braying tribe of them at the bottom of the sea, and now they were away down the roads to Holith's and Absol's and the widow's next conquest. And the silence they left behind them was not the peace he had promised himself, but a great echoing room in which there was all at once nothing to look at but the one thing he had spent 14 months knocking at. He came upon her that same afternoon in the long library, and it was not by chance, though he had told himself as he crossed the 2 draughty galleries to reach it that it was entirely by chance, that he merely wished a particular volume on the drainage of low pasture, that a landlord had a right to his own book room at 4 in the afternoon. She was on the 3rd step, a wheeled ladder with her sleeve turned back and a great folio open along her forearm, and the low sun came in level and gold through the tall west window, and lit the dust she had raised so that she stood in a slow shining haze of it, and she did not hear him at first. And for a moment, the length of a held breath, he had her unaware. He saw her mouth move over the page. He saw her free hand come up and turn a leaf with a particular care, the care of a person to whom books had once been rare and were still not quite believed in. And then a board betrayed him underfoot, and she looked round and down, and the ordinary composed nothing came over her face like a shutter drawn, and she began to come down from the ladder. "You need not," he said more sharply than he meant, for the shutting of her face had struck him like a small blow. "Stay as you are. What is it you have there?" She looked at the folio as though she had forgotten it. "The accounts of the home farm, your grace, for the years before your father's death. There is a thing in the reckoning of the West Meadows I wished to trace back, a rent that was let fall and never taken up again. I did not think anyone would want the room." "I do not want the room." It came out too plain, too naked, and he saw her mark it, and he turned half away to the shelves to give them both the mercy of his shoulder. "That is, the room may keep. Come down, Norcott, and tell me about your rent that was let fall. I find I have grown curious, this week past, about what has been going on beneath my own roof while I looked the other way." She came down. She stood on the flags with the great book held against her, the gold dust settling on the dark stuff of her gown, and she told him, plainly, without a scrap of the flourish another woman would have laid on so ripe an occasion, of the West Meadows and the lapsed rent, and the tenant who had died and the widow, who had gone on paying half and being asked for nothing, because no soul in the estate office had troubled to open the ledger, and of the melon frames when he asked, and of the quarrel between the cook and the dairy, and when he pressed her, of 100 small salvages besides, each one told as though it were the most natural thing in the world and no credit to anybody. A mere matter of a thing wanting doing and her hand being nearest, and he stood among his own books in the falling light and listened as he had not listened to any human creature in 20 years, and thought that he could have stood there and listened until the candles were wanted and the fires were lit and the whole short winter day had gone out around them, and counted it the best spent afternoon of his life. "How came you to know all this?" he asked at last. "The ledgers, the flues, the reckoning of butter. It is not, forgive me, it is not the common furniture of a young woman's education." For the first time something moved in her face that was neither the composed nothing nor the drawn shutter. It was not quite a smile. "No," she said, "it is not. My education, your grace, was got in a house where there was a great deal of learning and no money at all to keep it warm, and a girl who wished to eat learned early to make a small thing stretch to a large one, and to keep a book of accounts that would not balance however she wrote it, and to sit with a sick child through the night because the physician's fee was 3 visits in arrears and he would not come. My father was a scholar." She said the word without bitterness and without pride, laying it down flat between them like a card turned face up. "A very great one in a very small way. He knew 9 languages and the price of nothing. When he died there were his books, and his debts and me, and the books went to pay the debts, and I went." She stopped and inclined her head the smallest degree. "I went, your grace, where a girl in my case goes, to be useful in another's house, and then, in time, to be married to you." She said it as she said everything, without accusation. But the level gold light was full on both their faces now. There was no card table between them, no 6 laughing men, no widow's lamp. There was only the two of them, and the truth she at last let fall, and it landed in him with a weight he had not braced for. He had known, in the vague way a man knows the terms of a bargain he took no interest in, that she had come to him without fortune, without connection. A scholar's portionless daughter that his men of business had settled on, because she was gently bred enough to bear the name and poor enough to make no trouble over the getting of it. He had known it, and had never once thought of it. Had never thought of her at all as a creature to whom things had happened, who had buried a father and sold his books and gone to be useful in strangers' houses, and been passed at last across a lawyer's table to a cold man in a great house who called her a burden before his friends to raise a laugh. He looked at her standing there in the dust of his library, portionless and orphaned and self-possessed as a queen, and he understood that she had walked into his life carrying more than he had ever in his soft-cushioned existence been asked to carry, and had set it down nowhere, and had complained to no one, and had gone on quietly refounding the ruin of his estates by way, it seemed, of having something to do with hands that had learned they must always be doing. "You never told me," he said. His voice was not steady, and he did not trouble to steady it, any of it. "In 14 months. You never asked, your grace." And then, seeing perhaps that it had gone into him deeper than she intended, for she was not cruel, and had never in her life struck a blow for the pleasure of it, she softened, and set the great folio down upon the reading table, and said more gently, "And why should you have? I did not come here to be asked. I came to be a duchess, which is a thing chiefly of standing in the right place and wearing the right face and asking for nothing, and I have tried to do it well, because I was taught that a thing worth doing at all is worth doing, so that no one need ever come after you and do it again. I have not been unhappy." She seemed to weigh the word and to find it very nearly honest. "I have not been unhappy. I have had the house and the people of it, who are good people and have been kind to me in their way, and I have had," she gestured, a small motion of one turned back wrist that took in the long shelves, the ladder, the gold and the dust and the ranked spines of all the books her fathers had been sold to buy the like of. "I have had these. It is a great deal more than many women get. I have not thought myself ill-used." And that he found, that she did not think herself ill-used, that she stood in the wreck of every expectation a young woman might have carried to an altar and counted up her portion and pronounced it a great deal more than many get, that undid him past all the rest of it. He crossed the space between them before he had told himself to, and he was near enough now to see the fine dust caught in her lashes, and the pulse that beat, quick and human under all that stillness, at the base of her throat, and he lifted his hand. The hand that had never in its life betrayed him, that brought down its birds cleanly and turned its cards without a tremor, and he did not quite touch her. He held it there, a bare inch from her cheek, in the last of the level light, and she did not step back, and she did not step forward. She stood and looked up at him and let him see her looking, as she had let him see it once down the length of the table, and the whole long empty house held its breath around them, and the dust turned slowly in the gold. And for the space of 3 heartbeats the Duke of Ivolton stood on the very threshold of the green country he had ridden past for a year, with the gate standing open and his hand raised at last to knock. Then a clock somewhere below struck the half, thin and silver through the shut doors, and she drew a breath, and the composed nothing came back over her face, not shut this time, he thought, not against him, but drawn down gently the way one draws a cloth over a thing too newly made to be handled, and she stepped back the single step the ladder allowed, and said, "Lo, it grows dark, your grace. They will be wanting to light the fires, and to know whether you dine at home." And she gathered the great folio to her breast again, and inclined her head, and went from the room the way she went from all rooms, last and quiet and giving way. And he was left standing in the dark with his hand still half raised toward the place where her cheek had been, and the gold gone off the window, and his heart going in him like a boy's. He did not sleep. He walked the 2 galleries half the night in his shirt with a branch of candles, past the quainted faces of the Ivolton dead who had none of them, so far as their portraits told, ever in their long, feared magnificence loved a portionless woman or been undone by the dust in a scholar's daughter's lashes, and somewhere in the small hours Standing before the hard-shut face of his own father, he owned to himself the thing he had come into the world armored against owning. His father had married a beauty of great house and greater fortune, and had frozen her out of the world in 10 short years. Being a man who could not love and would not be seen to fail at it, and Rawdon had watched his mother go silent and then grey and then away, and had sworn over her narrow grave, at 11 years old, that he at least would never be so beggared by a woman, would never want. Where wanting could be refused him, would never hand any living creature the whip to flay him with. He had kept the oath 30 years. He had kept it so well that he had married expressly to keep it, had chosen a portionless nothing precisely, because a man cannot be beggared by what he has never valued, and had congratulated himself, God forgive him, on the neatness of the arrangement. And now the arrangement had turned in his hands like a live thing, and the nothing had a whole country behind her grey eyes, and the oath he had kept 30 years was so much cold ash on his tongue, and he stood before his father's portrait in the guttering light and was, for the first time since he was a boy of 11, afraid. For there was this, that he saw now with the pitiless clarity of the sleepless. It could not stay as it was. A door once opened does not consent to be a door forever. A man must go through it or shut it, and shutting it now would cost him more than he had known he had to lose, and going to her, plainly as a mouse to a woman he has wronged and wants. Laying down the armour of 30 years on the flags of his own library. That was a thing the Duke of Ivolton, feared through 3 counties, magnificent and cold and safe, did not in his soul yet believe he had the courage to do. He knew the shape of himself too well. He knew how, when the ground grew uncertain, he rose and bowed the exact degree and went out and was magnificent and left the woman by the fire with the pot in her hands. He had done it 4 mornings past. He was miserably certain he would find a way to do it again. That some old cold reflex would rise in him at the worst hour and undo, in a careless breath, what a year of quiet nursing could not mend, and that she, who had counted up so meagre a portion and called it more than many get, would take that final little nothing as she had taken all the rest, and incline her head and give way, and this time keep on going out through the door and not come back. He did not know, standing there in the cold with the candles failing, how near that hour already stood, nor by what small and characteristic act of his own making it would come. He knew only that the ground had opened under his safe and ordered life, and that he loved her. He made himself frame the word alone in the dark before his father's unforgiving face, and it cost him as much as any charge he had ever ridden down, that he loved her and had shown it. In 14 months, in no way whatever but contempt, and that the reckoning for so long a debt, when it came as it was coming, would not be gentle, and would not wait, and would fall when it fell upon exactly the man who had earned it. For 3 days after the walled garden, Rawdon was a man half-thawed and did not know himself, and did not much wish to. He came down early to breakfast, which he had not done in years, on the chance of finding her before the house woke. He devised errands to the still room and the succession houses that carried him past whatever room she kept, and once, coming upon her on the south terrace with her sleeve pushed back and her hands full of the last cut roses of the season, he had stood and talked with her of nothing at all. Of the frost that was coming, of whether the late damsons would keep for the better part of an hour, and had gone away lighter than he had gone away from anything in 20 years. He had told her, in the garden at dusk, more than he had ever told a living soul, of the boy weeping in the gallery, of the father who had taught him that to be seen was to be weak. She had listened without pity and without triumph, and had laid her hand once upon his sleeve, only that, and he had covered it with his own, and they had stood so, saying nothing, while the light went out of the sky, and it had been more than any embrace he could remember. He had thought, walking back through the dark box hedges with her small hand tucked into his arm, that a door long shut in him had come off its hinge at last, and that he would not, this time, put it back. He had reckoned without his friends. They were still in the house, that was the trouble of it. Holith and the Absols and half a dozen others, kept on past all decency by the good sport and the Duke's cellar, and grown in their long idleness both bored and observant. Bored men watch their host. And what they had begun to observe and to remark upon among themselves over the billiard cloth and the decanters was that Ivolton was not the man they had come to. The man they knew, the man they told stories of in their clubs, The great cold duke whom nobody's wit could reach and nobody's charm could warm. That man had somewhere in the last fortnight mislaid himself. This one came in from the coverts to ask after the Duchess's headache. This one had been seen by Holitha's own eyes carrying a woman's basket. It was, they agreed, prodigiously droll and not to be borne without comment, and being the sort of men they were, they did not make the comment privately. It was Holitha who fired it, on the last night but one, over the wine, when the ladies had withdrawn and the port had gone twice round, and the talk had got to that loose and cruel hour of an evening when men say the things they have been saving up. He was a florid, laughing man, Holith, without an ounce of malice and without an ounce of sense, and he leaned back and tilted his glass at his host and said, to the whole table, "I'll tell you, Ivolton were all monstrous curious, and I'll be the one to say it, for none of these cowards will. What have you done with yourself? A year ago you'd have had a man's liver out for looking at you sideways, and now here you are, meek as a curate, all for damsons and the Duchess's little walks. We had a wager on it above stairs. Absol says she's led you by the nose, and I say no duke living was ever led by a parson's girl, and I've 50 guineas on your answer. Come, tell us it isn't so. Tell us she's not made a tame thing of you." And there it was. Rowden felt the whole table turn to him and wait, wet-lipped and merry, and he felt beneath their waiting the old cold pull of it, the pull of being the man they feared, which was a warmer thing than any of them knew, for a man they feared was a man they could not touch. And he had lived inside that untouchableness so long that it had become the only skin he owned. He had one instant in which to choose. He knew it even as it happened. Long afterward he would know that he had known it. That the whole of his life had narrowed to that one breath between Holitha's laugh and his own reply, and that no one in the world had held a knife to him, and no villain had cornered him, and the door had stood open and he had shut it with his own hand. "Led by the nose?" he said, and heard his own voice come out in his father's cold, amused, killing drawl, and hated it, and did not stop it. "You do the lady too much honour, Holitha, and me too little. A man is not led by a nose he scarcely notices." He turned his glass in his fingers and gave them the smile they had come for, the smile that made them safe by making someone else the sport. "I married a quiet, dutiful, biddable creature of no fortune and no consequence, precisely so that I need never think of her above once a day, and I find the arrangement answers admirably. She keeps my roses and requires nothing of me. If you take that for tameness, gentlemen, you understand marriage even less than I credited. It is not that she has grown to matter. It is that she never did and never was meant to." He lifted the glass. "A wife should be a comfort a man may set down and forget, like a good fire. Mine has at least the grace to know it. I'll thank you to pay Absol his 50 and speak of something with more savour in it." The laugh came, huge and grateful, and Absol cried that he'd been robbed, and Holitha roared, and the port went round again. And Rowden sat at the head of his table, having won the room entire, master of it as he had always been master of it, feared and admired and wholly alone, and knew, in the very act of winning, and with a sickness rising in him that no wine would quiet, that he had said a monstrous thing, and had said it well, and could not now unsay it. He had taken the one true and living thing he owned, and he had thrown it on the cloth for these men to laugh at, to prove to them that he was still made of stone. And the worst of it, the thing that would not let him breathe, was that he had felt, in the saying, the old vile pleasure of it, the pleasure of the closed door, the safety of the cold, and had chosen that pleasure over her with his eyes wide open. He did not know, then, that the door into the dining-room stood a hand's breadth ajar. He did not know that the Duchess, having found among the withdrawn ladies neither air nor kindness, and Mrs. Marchetti's bright chatter more than she could that night support, had slipped out to the cool of the hall on her way to the gallery she loved, and had passed the dining door at the precise moment a man's cold, amused voice said, "A comfort a man may set down and forget." He did not know she had stopped. He did not know she had stood in the dark hall with one hand against the panelling and heard it out to the end. It is not that she has grown to matter. It is that she never did, and had not made a sound, and had not swept away, but had waited, quite still, until the laughter came and told her the thing was finished and had been enjoyed, and had then gone on steadily up the stairs, with her back very straight, exactly as she had gone up from 100 dinners, so that the footman who passed her on the landing saw nothing at all in her face and thought the Duchess a cold, contained little woman who felt things but shallowly. She felt them that night to the bottom. Rawdon learned none of this. He went up late and heavy, and lay awake despising himself, and resolved, a coward's resolution taken in the dark, that in the morning he would find her and mend it, would say some careful thing that stopped short of an apology, for a duke did not apologize, but that let her understand he had not meant the half of it. He was to find a day too late and a word too short. He had built his whole life upon the belief that there was time, that the cold could be put on and taken off at pleasure, that a thing set down might be picked up again unchanged whenever a man troubled to reach for it. It had never once occurred to him that a person was not a fire, and would not wait upon the hearth to be remembered, and might, being told to her face that she had never mattered, quietly and finally believe him. Letty did not weep. She had wept, years since, in a cold parsonage, all the tears she meant to spend on a house that did not want her, and had learned there the whole economy of grief, what was worth the spending and what was not. She sat that night at the little writing table in her chamber with a single candle, and she did not rage and she did not compose bitter speeches. She made lists in her small even hand of what was hers and what was not. The pearls were his mother's and would stay. The gowns had been bought to make a duchess and could stay too. She had come with 2 trunks and she would go with 2 trunks and no more, and owe the house nothing it could point to. She wrote 3 letters. One was to Mrs. Enderby, her uncle's old friend, a clergyman of small means and large heart, who kept a narrow house at Wells, and had written, at the marriage, that if ever the great world proved too great, there was a room and a welcome and no questions asked. One was to the man of business at Halloway who held in trust the £90 a year her uncle had left her, a beggar's portion for a duchess, a sufficiency for a woman resolved to be poor and free, and one, the shortest, she left unsealed upon the table for mourning. And it said only what a woman of her plainness would say and no more, that she thanked him for his roof and his name and the courtesy of his servants, that she had gone where she would be no further weight upon him, nor any subject for his friends' amusement, that he need send no one after her, for she went of her own will and asked nothing, and would take nothing that was his. She had begun it, your grace, and ended it, Letty Norcott, with her own name, the pewter plate name, and not the great one he had lent her and never meant her to keep, and that small resumption of herself. Had he been a man who could read it, would have told him the whole of the matter, that she had taken back the woman she was from the keeping of a man who had told a table full of strangers that the woman had never mattered. Before she sealed the last of it, she went down once through the sleeping house to the long gallery, with her own candle, as she had gone so many nights. She stood a while before the portrait of the old Duchess, his mother, the grave lonely face that did not require to be entertained, and she spoke to it, low, as one speaks the dead who cannot answer and are the safer for it. You knew him, she said. You knew the cold he was raised in, poor lady, for you were shut in it beside him. I had thought that between us we might have got him out. I find I cannot do it alone, and he will not have it done at all, and I will not spend the whole of my one life knocking at a door a man holds shut against me on purpose. You will forgive me, I think. I believe you of all souls would understand the leaving of this house. She curtsied to the picture, gravely as she had curtsied to its son on the night he had put her from him, and she took up her candle, and the light went with her out of the gallery for the last time. And the dead ladies were left to their dark. She did not go in secret, and she did not go in a passion. Both would have been a kind of scene, and she had resolved upon no scene. She rose before the house, as she had risen every morning of her life. And she dressed herself plainly in the grey she had been married in, and she saw her 2 trunks corded and carried down, and she gave the housekeeper, good Mrs. Fenwick, who had been kinder to her than most, her hand and her thanks and a purse for the maids, and said only that she was called away to an old friend who was ill and could not say for how long. She was so calm about it, so entirely without disorder, that not one servant in the hall suspected the truth. They thought it a visit. They wished her grace a good journey and a safe return. She stepped up into the carriage she had ordered for herself, with her own money, to carry her only so far as the posting-house at Halloway, where she would take the common coach and trouble the Duke's horses no further, and she looked once, and only once, at the great grey face of Yvelton with its 100 cold windows, and then she folded her hands in her lap and looked forward at the road and did not look back again. Rawdon was out. Of course he was out. He had risen early on purpose to be gone before he must face her. Telling himself he rode to see the far coverts drawn, but knowing he rode to put off the mending of a thing he was ashamed to mend, and so he was 3 miles off on the wet hill, sitting his horse among the beaters with Holly the braying beside him. When his wife's carriage went down the North Avenue and out at the lodge gates and turned toward Holloway, he saw it. That was the thing he could never, afterward, forgive himself, that he saw it, a small dark carriage crawling along the pale line of the avenue far below, and thought nothing of it. Or thought only, with a flicker of relief, that some of the guests were beginning at last to take themselves home, and turned his horse back to the covert, and did not give it a second glance. He watched her go and did not know he watched her go. He felt, if he felt anything, a little lightening of the day. He came in at dusk, muddied and cold and oddly restless, resolved now that the tiresome business must be got through, that he would seek her out before dinner and say his careful, half-relenting, unapologetic piece, and have the discomfort of it behind him. He asked the first footman where the Duchess might be found. The man did not know. Her Grace had gone away that morning. Gone away, said Rawdon, checked upon the stair, and something moved in him that was not yet alarm. To visit a friend, your Grace. Mrs. Fenwick would know the particulars. And he stood on the stair a moment with his gloves in his hand and told himself it was nothing, a visit, a sick acquaintance, some parish creature from her old flat country. She would be back within the week and he would say his piece then, and in truth it was as well, for it gave him time to frame it better. He was almost easy. He went up to dress and thought once, passing the door of the long gallery, that the house seemed unaccountably still, and set it down to the guests thinning, and thought no more of it. He did not find the note that night, for she had left it in her own chamber, and he did not go there. He dined among the last of his friends and was, they all remarked, in far better humour than he had been all the fortnight, quite his old cold easy self again, and Mrs. Marchetti was very brilliant. And Hollis told the story of the dog a second time, and Rawdon sat at the head of his table in the blaze of the second best plate, and did not know that the one chair down among the deaf old men, the chair that no one ever spoke to, was empty now for good, and would stay empty, and that the quiet point in the room around, which all the noise had used to part, was gone out of the house entirely, taken up in a common stage coach on the Wells Road under a sky going hard with the first true frost of the year. He thought the stillness he had felt on the stair was the stillness of an evening winding pleasantly down. He mistook the beginning of the rest of his life for the end of a tiresome week. He raised his glass to his laughing friends, master of his house and of himself, and had not the least idea in the world that he had lost everything he owned, and would not have it for 3 days more. The note was on the table in his book-room, propped against the inkstand where she had known he would come, and it was so like her, so exactly, so unbearably like her, that he stood a long while with it unopened in his hand before he could bring himself to break the plain wafer that sealed it. There was no crest upon it. She had never once, in 14 months, used the crest that was hers as much as his. She had written her few household notes on the commonest paper the still-room afforded, in a small even scholar's hand got, he now knew, at a poor man's table, and she had gone out of his life as she had lived in it, asking for nothing, taking nothing, leaving no more mark upon the great house than the faint, clean scent of the beeswax she had taught the maids to work into his neglected floors. Your Grace, the note said, I have thought it best to go, and have gone in the way that will make the least trouble to the house, which is early, and by the common coach from Holloway, that no carriage of yours need be put out. You will find the housekeeping accounts made up to Lady Day, and the keys in Mrs. Fenwick's hand, and a memorandum under this of the matters left unfinished, chief of them the West Meadow rent, which wants only your signature to set right, and the drainage of the low pasture, which Bourne understands and will carry through if he is bidden. I have asked nothing of the estate and take nothing from it but what I brought, which was little. I wish you very well, and the house, which deserves to be loved. Do not trouble to seek me. There is nothing wanting between us that seeking would mend. L. Norcott. She had not signed herself Yvelton. She had signed herself with the portionless name they had bought her out of, as though she gave him back the title along with the keys, folded small and clean and left upon the table with the rest of the things that had never truly been hers. He read it through twice, and then a third time, standing in the cold grey light of 6 in the morning with his neckcloth loose and yesterday's fire dead in the grate, and each time it was quieter and more ruinous than the last, for there was not in the whole of it one word of reproach for him to take hold of and be angry at. Not one accusation he might have stood against and answered, not one tear blotting the small even lines, nothing but a house set in order and handed back, and a wish that he might be well, and the flat closed door of "Do not trouble to seek me." She had not slammed it. She had drawn it to behind her as gently as she drew a cloth over a thing too newly made to be handled, and gone down in the dark to the common coach, and he had lain sleeping the sleep of the safe and magnificent not 40 yards off, and had not heard the wheels. And then it came upon him, all at once and complete, the thing he had done, not the note, not the going, but the act that had driven her to it, and he sat down slowly in the hard chair before the dead grate, because his legs would not for the moment be trusted, and lived it over. They had dined the county 3 nights since. He had not wanted it. She had arranged it quietly, because a duke who has shut his gates a year begins to be talked of, and she was careful of his standing as she was careful of his linen and his tenants and everything else of his that he neglected. And it had gone well, better than well. The long-called house had shone, the dinner had been faultless, and old Lady Farncombe, who had buried 3 husbands and feared no man living, had leaned to him over the sweets and said, in the carrying voice of the very deaf, that he had got himself a treasure, that she had not seen the Ivelton table, so becomingly kept since his mother's day, that his Duchess was a woman of parts, and he a luckier man than he looked. And down the table a small laugh had run, the easy laugh of full and idle people. And every face had turned upon Letty where she sat quiet and unregarding at the foot, and Rowden had felt the old ground open under him, the old cold terror of being seen to be beggared, of having the whip put into the hands of a room, and he had reached, as a drowning man reaches for the thing nearest him, though it be a stone, for the armour of 30 years. He had smiled the smile his father had smiled, and he had said lightly, so lightly, the Lady Farncombe was too good, that his Duchess did well enough at the ordering of a dinner, being a serviceable sort of creature bred to be useful, and that a man learned to be grateful for small competences in a wife when he had given over expecting anything higher of the bargain. And the room had laughed again, louder delighted, as rooms laugh at a great man's careless cruelties. And he had drunk his wine well pleased with the neatness of himself. The danger past, the ground closed up, and it was only when he had glanced, some half-minute after, toward the foot of the table to see how she took it, for he had wanted, God help him, to see her take it well, that he had found her chair empty, and the door beyond it just settling shut, and understood that she had risen and gone out during the laughter with her face composed and her step unhurried, and that not a soul but himself had marked her go. He had told himself that night that it was nothing. He had told himself she understood the necessities of such a room, that she of all women asked to be made no fuss of, that they would speak in the morning and it would be as the library had been. He had once owned, a man of great gifts in the matter of believing what suited him. And now it was 3 mornings after the morning of their speaking, and the coach was gone from Halloway with the dark, and he sat in the cold with her note in his hand and understood at last, with the pitiless completeness he had feared, precisely what he had done. He had taken the one creature who had never in 14 months asked him for a single thing, who had counted up the meagre portion he flung her, and called it more than many get, who had stood in his library with the dust in her lashes, and let him raise his hand to her cheek, and let him see her let him, and 3 days after, to save himself a moment's fright before a table of fools he despised, he had named her a serviceable creature and raised a laugh. He had done, after the open door, the very thing he had swum awake half the night swearing he would find some way to do. He had put the book into her hand himself, and she had not used it. She had only laid it down with the keys and gone. He did not remember rising from the chair, but he was on his feet and moving, and the house met him at every turn with her. It was in the warmed and shining floors, in the fires that some hand had learned, under her ordering, to lay so that they drew and did not smoke, in the great library where the gold dust had turned, and where he stood now in the grey dawn before the wheeled ladder and could not breathe, in the estate room, where he found her ledgers, her real ledgers, not the sham the steward kept for show, but the small, close true books in which she had traced, month upon patient month, every lapsed rent and mended fence and salvaged quarrel of the ruin he had let his father's house become, and had set it all quietly to rights and taken, by her own account, no credit and no thanks and no share, working in the dark of his neglect as a good servant works, or a wife who has nothing else permitted her to love. He turned the leaves of them by the cold window and read 14 months of her hands, and there was not his name in any tender place upon a single page, because he had given her no tender place to write it. There was only the house cared for past all deserving, and her small even scholar's hand keeping faith with it long after the master had broken faith with her. By full morning he had it from Mrs. Fenwick, whose eyes were red and whose voice was stiff with a servant's judgment she did not dare to speak and could not wholly hide, that her grace, the woman, would not, for all her cold master's example, unsay the title, had left an address, but only she had charged Mrs. Fenwick to say, for the forwarding of any matter of business, a bill of the tradesman's or the like, that ought not to fall on the house through her going. She had thought of the tradesman's bills. Walking out of a year of his contempt at 6 in a winter dawn with all her small courage in her 2 hands, she had stopped to think that a linen draper in the town might be left unpaid, and had left her direction against it. The direction was to the care of a Mrs. Enderby at Wells, in the next county but one, and the name went into Rowden like a key into a long disused lock and turned, for he had heard it from her own mouth in the library, a clergyman's widow, an old friend of her uncle's, one of the few souls left of that plain, hard world of her girlhood who had written to her still after the marriage carried her off into the great one, and who had promised, if ever it proved too great, a room and a welcome and no questions asked. She had not fled into ruin. She had gone, portionless and turned 25 and married and disgraced by no fault of her own, straight to the one door in England where that welcome waited and her worth was known, to stand at last, upon her own 2 feet on ground that was not his. The relief of it, when he understood she was safe, was so great it frightened him, and hard upon the relief came the black understanding that safe meant she had no more need of him at all, that she had proved, in 3 days, what he had spent 14 months failing to see, that Letty Norcott had never been the burden but always the whole strength of the arrangement, and could stand without him as a wall stands without the ivy, while he looked about the great cold house that her going had emptied of its single warmth. He could not, it seemed, so much as breathe in his own home without her. He rang for his horses to be got ready within the hour, and then countermanded it, and stood in the middle of the hall in a kind of vertigo of his own making, for the old cold reflex rose in him even now, even here, whispering in his father's very voice that a Duke of Ivelton did not go posting across 2 counties to run after a portionless woman who had left him, that it was beneath him, that it would be talked of, that she had said herself there was nothing seeking would mend, that a man of any pride would let her go with a settlement and a shrug and be magnificent about it and save his face before the county. He heard the voice with a clearness he had never had, and knew it at last for what it was, not strength, never strength, only the long cowardice of a boy of 11 who had watched his mother frozen away and sworn never to want where wanting could be refused him. And he saw, standing in the cold hall, that the oath had not kept him safe, it had only kept him alone, and had come within an ace now of keeping him alone for good. His father had been magnificent to the last, and had died in this house with no creature in the room that grieved him. Rowden looked down the long hall at the shut door, which they would carry him one day in his turn, and found that he would sooner be talked of in every drawing-room in the 3 kingdoms as the Duke who had ridden 2 counties to beg his own wife's pardon than lie down at the end of it in his father's magnificent and perfect solitude. He rang again, and this time did not countermand it, and told them he rode within the hour and would want no groom. He did not sleep at Wells. He had ridden the last of it through dusk and into a thin cold dark, and came into the little cathedral town near 10 at night with his horse blown and his own body one long ache, and no notion in his head of the fine humbling speeches a man rehearses on such a road, all of them ridden clean of him mile by mile until there was nothing left but the going itself. Mrs. Enderby's house he found by asking at the one inn, a narrow old stone house in the close under the great dark shoulder of the cathedral, with a light still burning low in a downstairs window. He stood at the gate of it a moment with his hand on the cold iron and the whole of his life behind him, the shooting party and the widow's lamp and the smile his father smiled and the serviceable creature and the laugh, and then he went up the flagged path and knocked, and heard within the scrape of a chair, and a step he knew, quiet and unhurried and giving way to no one, coming to the door. She opened it herself with a candle in her hand, and she was in a plain dark gown with a shawl about her, and her mending still caught in one hand. And she saw him standing bareheaded and travel-stained on the step in the cathedral dark, and she did not cry out, and she did not fall back, and she did not shut the door, though he saw her hand tighten on its edge. The composed nothing came over her face, but it did not hold, it could not, this time, quite hold. Something moved beneath it, quick and human, the pulse he had seen once beat at the base of her throat, and her grey eyes in the candlelight were not a servant's eyes nor a queen's, but only a woman's, weary and wounded and terribly awake. "You were bidden not to seek me, your grace," she said very low. "I know it." His voice was not steady. He had long since given over the trying to steady it. "I have never once done as I was bidden by you in 14 months. I did not think to begin at the last, when it is the only thing left me to give." He took off nothing, claimed nothing, kept his hat in his hand and the width of the threshold between them. "I have ridden since noon and I have no speech ready, Letty, none. I made a dozen and lost them all on the road. I am not come to bring you back. You are better where you are. I have seen your ledgers. I know now what I never troubled to know, that you were never the burden of that house but the whole strength of it, and that you can stand and have stood and want nothing of me. I am not come to offer you a settlement, or my name, which you gave me back folded on the table, or anything that is mine to grant, for I have grown to see there is nothing of mine you have ever wanted or ever will. I am come only to tell you the truth, which I owe you and have never paid, and then to go if you bid me, but to tell it first, standing here, whatever it costs me, because I have been a coward in your house every day for a year, and I find I have not the stomach to be one on your step as well." The candle flame stood straight and small between them in the still cold air of the close. She did not speak, she watched him. She let him see her watching, as she had let him twice before, and this time he did not raise his hand, and he did not reach, and he did not spare himself. "I called you a serviceable creature before Lady Farncombe's table," he said, 3 nights gone, "because a deaf old woman praised you and the ground opened under me, and I was afraid, not of you, of myself, of being seen to hold you dear. Of handing a room full of fools the whip my father taught me no man must ever hand a soul. I have been afraid of that whip since I was 11 years old, and watched it kill my mother by inches in that house, and I swore over her grave I would never want where wanting could be refused. And I married you, Letty, I will say it, you have the right of it, and I the shame. I married a portionless girl on purpose, that I might never be beggared by loving her, and I have kept that oath so faithfully and so well that I have all but lost the one creature in the world I—" He stopped. His hand closed hard on the brim of his hat. The great cathedral loomed black and silent above them, and the candle did not so much as waver. "That I love," he said plainly, into the dark, the word coming out of him as the truth had come out of her in the library, laid down flat and face up between them at last. "That I have loved, I think, since before I let myself know it, and shown it to you in 14 months in no way under heaven but contempt. I am not asking you to answer it. I have earned no answer. I am only, for once in my life and standing in the cold where I belong, telling you the truth, and asking your pardon, not the Duke's pardon. There is no such thing worth having, a man's, mine, Rowden's for every day of it. That is the whole of what I came to say." The silence that followed, when he had said it all and had no more in him to say, was the longest of Rowden's life. He stood in the middle of Mrs. Enderby's small cold parlour at Wells with his hat crushed in both hands like any suitor off the road, mud to the knee, 3 days unshaven. A duke who had ridden through 2 nights and a frost to stand upon a bare scrubbed floor and be looked at. And Letty sat by the narrow window with her mending fallen into her lap and looked at him, and did not rise and did not speak, and let the whole weight of what he had confessed settle into the room until he thought he must go down under it. He had not spared himself. That was the one thing he had resolved upon, kneeling in his own gallery 3 nights since before his mother's grave painted face with her note open in his shaking hand, that whatever else he made of this ruin, he would not, this once, be sparing. So he had told her the truth of the dinner, not the softened truth but the whole of it, that no man had held a knife to him, that Holitha's jest had cornered him not at all, that the door had stood open and he had shut it with his own hand for the mean warm pleasure of being feared. He had told her that he had watched her carriage crawl down the avenue from the wet hill, and had felt his day grow lighter. He had told her he was his father's son to the marrow and had been proud of it, and that pride had cost him the one living thing that had ever come warm into his house. And that he had come not to command her home, for he had no more right to command her than the frost had, but only to say it to her face before she was lost to him past all saying, that she had never been the burden, that he had been, that she was the whole of what had ever mattered under his roof, and he had told a table of fools she did not matter, because he had been more afraid of being seen to love her than of losing her, and he had got in exact justice the thing he had chosen. "I have no case to put to you," he said, when even that was spent. "I had thought, on the road, that I might find something to say that would answer, and there is nothing. A man who says a thing to be cruel does not get to say afterward that he did not mean it. The cruelty was the meaning. I only could not let you go on believing the lie of it. You did matter. You are the only thing that ever did. That is all I came to say. I will not trouble your friend's house past the saying of it." Letty was quiet a long moment. Then she folded her mending, precisely, along its old creases, and set it on the sill and rose, and she came a little way toward him across the small room and stopped, out of reach, with her hands loosely clasped before her grey gown, the grey she had been married in, he saw, and married and left in both. And she looked up into his face with those steady eyes that had never in 14 months flattered him and did not begin now. "I believe you," she said. "That is the first thing, and you had better have it plainly, for you look as though you expected to be turned out into the road. I believe you mean every word, and I believe it cost you to come, and I am not made of stone myself. Whatever your friends supposed of me, it is no small thing to hear it. But belief is not the whole of it, Rowden, and you must not think that because I do not send you away I am gathered up." She drew a small breath. "I did not weep when I left you. I want you to know that. I did not leave in a passion, and I have not sat here these 3 days wishing you would come. I left because I asked myself a plain question and got a plain answer, and the question was this: whether I would spend the one life I am given knocking at a door a man holds shut against me on purpose, and I found I would not. I am poor, and I am plain, and I was got up in a great house to be looked past, and I bore all of that, for I had chosen it, and there was sweetness in it too. But I will not be a thing set down and forgotten, not by you, not by anyone. I had rather be Letty Norcott on 90s a year in Mrs. Enderby's back room and my own than the Duchess of Ivelton and no one's at all. I know it," he said low. "Then know the rest," she said, and now something moved under the steadiness, and her voice was not quite even. "For I could come back to your house tomorrow and be a duchess again. I could keep your roses and grace your table, and take my mother-in-law's chair, and the world would call it a great match mended, and you might tell yourself you had done handsomely by me. And it would be the lie all over, only quieter. I do not want your rank, Rowden. I never wanted it. It was the price of you, and I paid it and thought it dear. I do not want to be rescued, and I will not be taken back like a fire that has only wanted stirring. If you have come for the Duchess, to set your house to rights, to stop your friends' mouths, to have the empty chair filled, then you may go home, and I will wish you no ill, and I will do very well here. I will only have the man, or nothing at all." And Rowden, who had spent his whole life at a distance from every living soul, who had been taught in a cold nursery that to be seen was to be weak, and had built of that lesson a fortress that had kept out the entire world and his wife with it, Rowden crossed the little that was left between them, and did the one thing in all his life he had never once done, which was to stand before another person with nothing held back and nothing held in reserve, no drawled, no called, no door, and let himself be wholly seen. "I have not come for Duchess," he said. "Ivelton may fall down stone from stone before I care who fills a chair in it. I have come because in 3 days without you the house was not quiet, it was dead, and I with it. because I went down to the gallery to be alone as I have always gone, and found I could not bear my own mother's face for the knowing that she had lived and died in the same cold I was handing on, and had had no Letty come to warm it, because a man told me a fortnight since that I had got myself a better wife than I yet knew, and he was righter than he dreamed. And I did not know it until the knowing could ruin me. I want no rank between us and no rescue. I want to sit an hour on a terrace and talk of nothing at all, and go away lighter than I have gone from anything in 20 years. I want the woman who laid her hand on my sleeve at dusk and asked me for nothing and gave me back myself. If you will have only the man, then it is the man who is standing here, and he is not much. He is a proud, cold, frightened creature who has done you a great wrong. But such as he is, there is not one part of him kept back from you, and there never shall be again. I am asking. I have never in my life asked anyone for anything. I am asking you to have me. For a moment more she held out, or seemed to, and then her steadiness broke, not into weeping but into something better. A kind of light coming up in her plain, kind face like sun on the flat, wet country she had come from, and she reached and took his mud-stained hand in both of hers, as simply as she had reached for the last roses of the season, and held it. And he covered them over with his other hand exactly as he had done in the walled garden with the light going out of the sky, and they stood so, saying nothing, in the middle of the bare, cold parlour, while somewhere in the house Mrs. Enderby had the grace to keep to her kitchen, and it was as it had been at dusk among the box hedges, more than any embrace that either of them could remember, and this time no dinner and no friend, and no drawl of a dead man's voice would come between it and the morning. They did not back that day, nor the next. He would not have her flung again into the great grey house as a duchess restored before the servants had done wondering, and she would not go until she was sure, not of him, she said, for she was sure of him now, but of herself, that she went as Letty who chose it and not as a thing reclaimed. So he took a room at the inn at Wells like any traveller, and came each forenoon and sat in Mrs. Enderby's parlour, and was taught, at 39, the wholly foreign art of courting his own wife, of talking of nothing at all, of frost and damsons and the price of coach fares, of sitting an hour with a woman and wanting only to be in the room she was in, and Mrs. Enderby, that clergyman's widow of small means and large heart, who had opened her narrow door to a duchess with no questions asked, and now found a duke on her step with his hat in his hands, watched the two of them over her mending, and said to Letty, on the third evening, that she had buried a good man 40 years since, and had never thought to see again in this world the particular look a man wears when he has stopped protecting himself against someone, and that Letty might do a great deal worse than a duke who had ridden through a frost to be looked at on a scrubbed floor. When at last they came home to Ivelton, it was near a fortnight on, and the first hard frost had settled the country white and still. He had written ahead, not to command the house, but to give one order and no more, that Mrs. Fenwick should have the Duchess's rooms opened and warmed and filled, every one of them, with the last of the succession house flowers, so that the woman who kept his roses should come back into a house that had at last remembered her. And he had written a second letter, which cost him more, had not spared himself in that either, for he found when they came that his friends had not all scattered after all. Holliver was there, and the Absols recalled, for Roden had summoned them, plainly in that second letter, to Ivelton for a night's dinner near Christmas, and had said in it what a duke does not commonly write, that he had a wrong to set right before the same company that had heard it done. And Audley's Marchetti was there too, who had contrived her own invitation, as she contrived all things, scenting some sport in the Duke's strange humble note, and meaning to be present at whatever was toward. So the table was very near the table it had been, the same florid laughing men, and the same bright hard beautiful woman, the same second-best plate ablaze down the length of it, and when the covers were drawn and the port stood ready to go round, Rowden did not send the Duchess away with the ladies. He rose at the head of his own table, and he took his wife by the hand and brought her up the length of it to stand beside him in her grey, and he faced the men he had made her sport for, and he was not, this time, afraid to be seen. "You had a wager of me once, in this room," he said, into the whole hushed length of it, and his voice did not drawl. "Holliday asked me whether my wife had made a tame thing of me, and I answered him with the cruelest lie I have ever told, that she was a comfort a man might set down and forget, that she had never mattered and was never meant to. She heard it. She was at that door, and she heard it, and she left my house, and she was righter to leave it than I have been about anything in the whole of my life. I have brought you back here to unsay it before every one of you who heard it said. She is not a burden, and she never was. She is the best thing that has ever come under this roof, and the only thing in it worth the keeping, and everything you take me for, everything you have feared and admired, and told your stories of, is worth less than 1 hour of her plain company, and I would give the whole of it. This house and this name and your good opinion with it, to have deserved her, which I do not, and mean to spend my life attempting. He looked down the table once at Odolly's Marchetti, without heat. You told me, madam, that changing did not agree with everyone. You were mistaken in one particular. It agrees with me entirely. And he turned from all of them to his wife, and lifted her hand and said, so that the deaf old men at the bottom of the table heard it plainly, this is the Duchess of Ivolton, who was Letty Norcott, and is the whole of what I have. I will thank you to drink to her, gentlemen, and I will not have her spoken past at my table again while I live. There was a silence, and then old Hollis, who had no malice and no sense, and it now appeared, a rough vein of grace under both, got heavily to his feet with his glass held high, and said, by God, Ivolton, the Duchess, in a voice gone thick, and Absol was up beside him crying it, and the deaf old men, and the whole board on its feet with the candlelight swimming in the lifted glasses, the Duchess, while Odolly's Marchetti drank too, sweetly, and found, when she looked for a wall to warm lamp against, only a man who had turned entirely away from her, toward a plain woman in grey, and did not so much as remember she was in the room. Letty stood through it with her back very straight and her chin steady, as she had stood through 100 dinners at which no one drank to her at all, but Rowden, close beside her, felt her hand tighten once upon his hard, and saw the bright rim to her eyes and be blinked away, and knew that the woman who had wept out all her tears in a cold parsonage long ago had very nearly spent one more, and was glad past speaking that he had lived to be the cause of it. They grew old at Ivolton in the end, and the house was never cold again. The great door of him that had come off its hinge in the walled garden he never once put back. He had thought that first dusk that he would not, and he did not, though it took him years to learn to leave it standing open without flinching, and she taught him patiently, damson by damson and frost by frost, as she had taught him everything worth his knowing. There were children in the long gallery in time, and they were not taught, those children, that to be seen was to be weak. They were taught by a grave man who came in muddied from the coverts to ask after their mother's headache, and who could be found of a summer evening on the south terrace with his sleeve pushed back and his hands full of the woman's roses, talking of nothing at all for the better part of an hour and going away lighter than any duke had a right to go. He had his mother's portrait moved, one autumn, out of the dark gallery into the warm morning room where the family sat, so that the grave lonely face that had never in life been entertained should keep company at last with a house full of noise, and be lonely no longer. And Letty understood without his telling her why he had done it, and put her hand in his before the old Duchess's painted eyes, and said nothing, which was, between the two of them, the fullest thing that could be said. He had told a table of fools once that a wife should be a comfort a man might set down and forget. He had lived to learn the whole cost of the sentence and the whole falseness of it. And if you had come upon the Duke of Ivolton in his last years, that once feared, once cold, once guarded man, you would have found him in no fear at all of being seen, seated close beside a plain grey-haired woman whom the great world had been raised up to overlook, holding her hand upon the arm of the settle as though it were the one possession in all his wide estates he could not do without, which it was. And he would have told you, without a drawl and without a flinch and without the smallest wish to be feared by you or by anyone, that he had once had everything a man could want and had thrown it on the cloth to be laughed at, and had been given, by a mercy he had never earned, the one thing he had done nothing to deserve, the chance to pick it up again and cherish it and never set it down.